door.
Yep.
And it can take
Attendance,
roll call and
Okay.
we have Pledge of Allegiance here unless we just want to say that for the regular.
I think we should just do that at the regular meeting.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order and roll call. Let records show that everyone is here except Mr. Arthur.
And so for the work session tonight, Carrie and I have been working with Brock from Baker Tilly on our bonds, and some of the conversation has led to the new legislation, and there's still a lot to kind of see exactly how all of that falls into place and DLGF and how they're going to interpret everything. But we thought tonight would be a good night to bring Brock down and provide the board some training just to kind of get your mind set and kind of what to look for and some of the basics on how that's going to be impacting us here in the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Brock.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Good to be back here in Washington, of course. Kevin begged me to take all 3 hours and the first half of the game tonight, so I told him I wouldn't do that though. So as Kevin mentioned, Brock Baker Tilly been helping Carrie and Kevin with bond planning, and prior to that, like the prior superintendent. So we've been keeping an eye on this legislation. So as Kevin mentioned, there's still new information that's coming through. Even today, after a webinar with the Department of Local Government Finance, DLGF, who administers all budgets for local municipalities throughout the state of Indiana, more changes are coming. It was over a 300-page bill. They're releasing interpretations. So I was trading emails today with them about some of the things that we'll talk about this evening and trying to gain their clarity of how it may impact Washington schools. So goal for tonight is walking through some initial analysis on Senate Enrolled Act 1 and what it could mean for Washington going forward. As Kevin mentioned, this is not to be definitive yet. This is really just to show where you could be headed directionally based upon what we know as of today. What we understand is the General Assembly will likely continue to tinker with property taxes over the next few years. So we'll see how that could impact in future years. So what we anticipate is this discussion is probably the first of multiple we'll have, not over just 2025, but in the coming years. I'll go ahead and turn you on. Sure do. Okay. Nope.
Try clicking on it once on the board, tap the board, and then try. Technology has stage fright.
Yeah. It's great. It works well. I'm fine just doing that if that works best.
Sure, must have ran out of batteries. Well, there we go.
You got it?
It's good now.
Oh, you're the man. You intimidated it.
Yeah.
You don't intimidate. Yeah. You want me to get closer? There we go. That's why. Out of range.
It must be running low on juice.
So 5 things we'll talk about, not in great detail, but we'll just stay on them. SCA 1, the impact, look at some property tax changes, the potential school impact. Just quickly remind you about the debt planning we had that you all approved earlier in late 2024, early 2025, and just talk about next steps and what you could contemplate. So before we do that, just a quick frame of reference on looking back at what legislation both federally and state that have impacted schools over the past 35 years. So often get the question, even at a community meeting I was at last night for another school district, is why aren't things just the way they were when I was growing up, and how much more schools are doing? So there's been a lot of legislation and a lot of regulations that have come through from early 90s to now 2025. So things are different just because of all the regulations that have added up over that time period. Looking at 2020s, not to focus on COVID, but more recently, just all the inflationary pressures that are facing school districts, employee shortages, and now in combination with what could be some challenges on the horizon financially. So just compounding everything over the past 35 years. So a quick summary year by year of what's being done to schools. So beginning in 2025, there's a requirement to have a beginning teacher pay to be no less than $45,000. That takes effect July 1st, 2025. And
We're there.
then the combination of that is looking at your education fund. As this team knows, education fund, operations fund, and debt service are your major funds. So looking at your education fund, beginning July 1st, 2025, your total teacher compensation between salaries and benefits, are you spending at least 65% of your tuition support or state aid on teacher compensation? That is an increase from 62% passed in prior legislations. But to get more to the property tax impact, I won't spend too much time on this, but the non-exempt debt service tax rate, they lowered the requirement where schools would have to go to referendum for any future capital needs. You're way under that threshold, so that really doesn't impact Washington at this point. If Washington were ever to choose to pursue the referendum, not recommending that tonight, but just sharing it for reference, all future referendum have to go to an even year November ballot. You'll see about a handful come as kind of a last opportunity in November of 2025, but after July 1st, 2025, all of them have to be on a November even year election. There's a 1-year cooling off GO bond. That really doesn't impact you because you've had repayment terms longer than 5 years, except for the most recent bond. So what it means is that you would have to have a cooling off period for when those bonds mature. So we couldn't issue a bond in 2026, but you've been planning this larger project around a larger issuance. So again, it won't impact Washington as part of your plan. The big changes, though, that we're going to talk about tonight are in 2026 and beyond. So you've probably heard a lot about the property tax changes that are occurring. And what this is essentially a 5-year, 6-year implementation for new homestead deductions. And homestead properties are defined by the state of Indiana is your main residence plus 1 acre of property, or up to 1 acre of property. So all homestead properties will be receiving, you'll see greater deductions over the next 5 years that will impact net assessed value. We'll get into some of these details here shortly. Homesteads are not the only properties you'll see that will begin to receive some level of deduction. The 2% bucket properties, so that is agricultural land, long-term care, and rental property, will begin to receive deductions, and they never have in the past, but will begin to receive deductions beginning in 2026 and phase into a greater amount in 2031. In addition to that, business personal property, 13% of your net assessed value is made up of this business personal property, will begin to receive a greater amount that is considered de minimis in 2027. So the 1% property, the 1% properties are homestead properties, will be receiving a greater deduction over the next 5 years. 2% properties, ag land, long-term care, rental property will be receiving greater deductions, will be receiving deductions over the next 5 years. Then that third bucket, 3%. So commercial property, industrial property, business personal property has access to some deductions. So what it means is net assessed value that you once were blessed with likely will be shrinking over the next 5 years. But we'll get into that in a bit more detail. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but the main point I want you all to understand as a school board is that the General Assembly, with what they did in tinkering with property taxes this past session, they gave different avenues for cities to pursue additional revenue. So they are able to shift some of their revenue to lit or local income tax. While they took away that option from schools because schools were specifically not able and are not able to pursue revenue through local income tax. So the point being, again, the schools have fewer levers to pull compared to the peers on the city county side. In 2028, we'll look through a model, but this really won't impact Washington schools. Schools across the state of Indiana, depending upon the formula, may have to share revenue with charter schools. And that does not differ by county. That's all throughout the state of Indiana. We'll continue to walk through in the coming slides through 2031, the continued phasing of these new deductions. So it's not just a one and done type of change. This is going to be a phase in that'll be a year by year impact for Washington. So first things first, as the state of Indiana likes to say, they're funding education at the highest level they ever have. While technically that is true, highest amount of budget ever is going to all K-12, and that's vouchers, charters, and public schools, traditional public ed. So for Washington's sake, the information that they released is part of House Enrolled Act 1001. As you know, the House Bill 1001 is always the budget bill every 2 years. So what is part of the budget that they approved is part of the Washington schools estimate, ADM, average daily membership, which is essentially the enrollment. 2025 is what is actually being received in fiscal year 2025. But the estimate for 2026 and 2027 are based upon some estimated growth. So as part of the funding, what they compared is estimating that you're going to be receiving funding that you're technically already receiving for textbooks. So once you segregate that out and pull out on paper what you're already receiving, Washington schools, if you assume that student growth is going to be receiving 0.5% new money per student in fiscal year 2026 and 1.4% new money in 2027. Washington schools, even with some student growth, 17 kids in 2026, an additional 13 kids in 2027. So if you have 30 more kids over the next 2 years, estimating about 2% new money collectively over the next 2 years. Not each year, but collectively over the next 2 years.
Can you explain that again? Just the part with the textbooks that you said?
So what we've segregated out here, on paper, they were showing that Washington schools would receive 2% and almost 3% new money over the next 2 years. But what that included is money that you're already receiving, about $150 per student to help pay for textbooks.
Okay.
You may recall, and I'm sorry for glazing over this, 2-3 years ago, you were paying a textbook rental fee for your kids.
Not no more.
They eliminated that and are now giving schools $150 per kid. But they included it as part of their analysis saying, hey, we're giving you this new money, but you're already getting it in 2025. So technically, yes, you're receiving it, but it's not new money.
And they're also not pulling that textbook rental money out before they're calculating the 65%.
Another good point.
So we went from 62 to 65%. So if you think about the education fund, we pulled 15% out off the top to go to fund operations. And then of that 85% that's left, we've got 65% of it that has to go for teacher salaries and benefits. But included in that is $400,000 of textbook rental that can't go to teacher salary and benefits because we've got to buy textbooks with it. So, but Brock, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this year with the 65%, there's no like penalty, right? It's, you still have to report it, but.
Yeah, you have to have a hearing on why you didn't get the
Right.
65%. You get part of the naughty list, but there's no penalty per se.
And then may I ask for just so I'm clear, the 65% for teachers, we say teachers, that's just the certified people in the classroom. That doesn't cover any
non-certs.
non-certified.
It doesn't
and
even cover,
Admin.
Admin,
it
anything,
doesn't
like
even
just,
cover the
okay.
librarian. It doesn't cover.
That's what I thought, but I want to make
It's
sure.
counselors and classroom teachers.
So I thought that, so I,
So, no, thank you, Carrie, appreciate you jumping in there. And talking with Kevin and Carrie the other day is, well, that's all well and good as projecting some student growth, but what if Washington schools didn't grow for the next couple of years? Well, you can see what that turns out to be with new money. So talking about going back to that inflationary pressures that schools are facing, just like everyone at home, all businesses throughout Washington. But how much new money could be available for staff increases, staff compensation? If there's no growth, 0.5%. And again, no new growth, and still targeting, they're saying.
You're just keeping the 2025 ADM.
Just keeping the 2025 ADM flat, and it's 0.7%. So collectively 1.2% over the next couple of years, based upon what we're seeing in funding.
Kevin is already trending down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's the concern.
yeah, that's.
Right now, on paper, it looks like we're gonna be less than where we were at
30 or 40 bucks.
well, like right around 2,500, I'd say, maybe 2,490 or so.
20 or 25.
Yeah,
So pretty tight, pretty lean years coming up over the next couple of years, especially in light of requiring minimum salaries to be maintained.
the thought that I've had on it is, are they forcing us? And it'll really be a conversation with the staff. I don't think they want us adopting new curriculum like as frequently as maybe we have been. We might have to push that off, which, you know, teachers like having the new every 6 years, but if we're having to pull out, that might be something we have to start looking at.
Well, and the $150 per kid, if you look at what that equals out to be versus what we were collecting back when we were charging, it's significantly less, because that $150 per kid, 151 or whatever it is per kid, does not include any kind of consumable fee. So we used to be able to charge, you know, $50 per kid for art class to help pay for the clay, because clay's expensive, or you know, any of those digital management classes, any of those that have a lot of supplies that the kids are consuming, and none of that is included in the monies that we get now. So, and we can't charge them for it. So we're kind of just chipping away at that cash balance that we've got in the education fund, trying to fund those kinds of things. Because textbook rental used to be a standalone fund, and in 2025 now it's not. It's all combined into the education fund.
Kevin, Rob, remember when we went to Jasper a couple weeks ago?
Mhm.
He said there was 3 things that we could charge for. Do you remember, was one of them like band instrument rental? I wrote them down in my
It's-
notes, but I can't remember.
Yeah, he gave some examples.
And I'm wondering
I've heard
if we're charging for them.
We haven't.
We haven't
The
been.
meetings I've been in, it's of the superintendent meetings, it's been a lot of talk of they've got the new legislation, but nobody really knows exactly how to interpret it. You kind of be going out a little bit. And so most superintendents that I've been talking with aren't changing anything for this next year until there's more guidance from the DOE on, but I think it was like band, you know, like dual credit.
I wrote it down. I
Charges.
just can't remember off the top of my head.
Uh,
I have my notes.
I'm not sure the
So I
risk
left
is
that
worth the risk,
Oh,
Okay.
because it would be a kind of a more, in my opinion, liberal interpretation of the new legislation.
Yeah.
Because I think the legislation is intended to not charge parents anything. So is there a gray area? Probably. Could we live in the gray area? Maybe. But what if we get, what if eventually the state comes and interprets it in a different way than what we have? Then we're on the hook for those dollars. So.
Yeah, state departments are still going through their regulations, so it's hard to make decisions in absence of their interpretations.
That's frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it's, a lot of things were done that I'm still trying to understand that. I don't describe it as damage because.
Just ask IE.
Property taxes, but there is an implication.
Yeah.
So let's get into some of those property tax changes that are occurring. So I want to give a quick frame of reference. If we just took a quick snapshot of Washington schools in 2025. This is all from the DLGF website. Your certified approved levy, 6.6 million. That doesn't mean that's what you're receiving. That's your certified levy before circuit breaker is calculated in. The total net assessed value, a quick sidebar, as this group knows really, really well, a quick reminder, net assessed value is the taxable value. We're going to talk about gross AV and net AV. Gross AV is the market value for property. Net assessed value is the taxable property. So the total taxable value for Washington Community Schools in 2025, 844 million. The tax rate is about 78 cents. You are the 54th lowest tax rate in the state of Indiana of about 290 school districts. So you're in the bottom 17%-ish. And just a quick reminder, tax rate is per $100 of assessed value. So that essentially means that's a percent. So 0.78% of property. But again, coming back to those buckets of property, 1% is homestead property. So because they're paying 1% of their market value or gross assessed value. But the net or taxable value for all homestead properties, about 353 million, or about 41% of your total AV. 2% bucket, residential, ag land, long-term care, about 280 million, or about 33%. Then the 3% buckets, commercial and industrial and business personal property, both about 13%. I'm sharing that because as a quick reminder, as we start going through what these new deductions are, get a frame of reference on who's getting the biggest deduction and what that could do to your overall net assessed value. Always like to give a frame of reference as well. So this is the 10 largest taxpayers in Washington Community School Districts. We are annually required to file this to your bondholders. So those banks and investors who purchase Washington Schools bonds, we have to update them on an annual basis. And these are one of the metrics that we provide with being the 10 largest taxpayers. So another frame of reference on AV, looking at the top 10 taxpayers, it's about 184 million of that approximate 844 million. So your top 10 taxpayers represent about 21% of your total net assessed value. It's typically a little bit higher than what rating agencies like to see. It's not a negative at all, but they typically like to see this number be between 12 to 15%. It's just a metric that they mark because of the risk that if one or more of these companies went out of business, what it does to your overall AV. That's the only reason that's a concern by a rating agency. So again, just sharing that as a point of reference only. So getting into now the property tax deductions. So think about you, the homeowner. What's happening over the next 6 or so years is your current standard deduction of $48,000 is going to phase out to zero by 2031. So a flat deduction amount being phased out. The supplemental homestead deduction, which in your 2025 taxes is 37.5%, is increasing to 66.7%. So what the General Assembly recognized is as AVs were increasing year by year because home values were going up, this flat standard deduction was not keeping pace with that. So the net assessed value was rising more rapidly than what they were comfortable with. So because of that, they went to this more percentage-based system. So ultimately, by 2031, 2/3 of every property now will not be taxable. We'll get into this a little bit later, but they added this additional supplemental homestead credit of the lesser of $300, 10%. We'll walk through an example of what that means. They increased the 65 and older amount for a credit of $150. That is income-based for 65 and older, so they increased the threshold for the income. Then there's a disability credit as well as part of the new legislation. So this might be a little bit difficult to see, but what we wanted to share with you all is if you look at the average home value in Washington schools. So according to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 2025, average value is about $153,000. So as you saw on the prior page, subtract off 48,000. So those of you who want to do it and follow along on your phone, take that 153,300 minus 48,000, and you multiply that by 0.375, and you get the supplemental homestead credit amount or deduction amount. Ultimately, once you do the math, you have that taxable value of about 65, almost 66,000. If you take that same home over the next 6 years and assume that the trending value or the annual market value will increase 3% per year, so a pretty modest amount of what inflation is doing. So taking 153,300 and assume next year it's 158,000 almost. In the old system, that net assessed value would have been about 71,000. But with Senate Rule Act 1, that net assessed value, because we're going to a 40% homestead supplemental homestead deduction, that net assessed value is essentially flat. So now you can see comparing the AV, the SCA 1 AV is about 8% less than what it would have been under the old system. So the AV increase, and this is the row I want you to keep your eye on, is bottom line for illustrative purposes, what that net assessed value increase year by year is going to be. So the further you go out, because that deduction percentage gets bigger, sorry, Scott, but as you go out, even with annual 3% increase year by year, that average homeowner in 2025 is only paying a $62,000 net assessed value amount compared to 2025. So the net assessed value in 2031 will be less than what it is in 2025, which is great for taxpayers. But it does create some challenges with tax rates, tax rate planning for local municipalities. But again, I want to keep this in the back of your mind, what this trending factor is. So it bottoms out in 2031. As you saw, that's when legislation is fully implemented. It's in 2032 and beyond when we start seeing some rebound and should expect some increase in net AV from that point. Any questions over that?
That's just on current property, though. That's not
This is
single
just homestead property. You're exactly right. This is. Yep. So let's look at what an illustrative tax bill would look like, making some really broad assumptions. So coming back to that average home value of 153,000. I didn't provide all the detail on how I got to the net assessed value because you can refer to the prior slide. But those same assumptions, let's take somebody who lives within the city of Washington. So about 45% of your net assessed value is within the city of Washington borders. The total tax rate for those who live in the city of Washington is about $3.48. That's the tax rate paid to the school corporation, library, county, city, what else? If there's overlapping township, so all taxing units, $3.48 tax rate. You take that 65,813 times 3.4766 divided by 100, you will get 1,533. So, oh, excuse me, no, you get 2,288. This 1,533 is 1% of the gross assessed value. So that's what the maximum amount that taxpayer can pay. Thank you for correcting me. So this 2,288 in Washington, homeowners, and homeowners only, receive what's called a property tax replacement credit. It's about 20%. And what that is you're paying a portion of local income tax to offset your property taxes. So the county council made that decision where your income tax is being applied to reduce your property taxes. So that 20% credit to the school corporation in all other units is they receive a portion of income tax as well as property taxes, again, to offset the property tax bill. You'll see in 2028, that goes away with this new legislation. But for taxpayers, that credit reduces their bill by $478. So before circuit breaker is calculated, it would be a $1,810 bill. But for 2025, as you know, that 1,810 is more than the 1,533. So the impact or reduction to that property tax bill is $277. So that taxpayer, that average taxpayer who lives in Washington City, is paying $1,533. Now, as net assessed value drops, to maintain the same level of levy, so making some pretty broad assumptions on Washington Schools levy, the city of Washington, library, and all assuming like 4% growth for the max growth quotient, that tax rate is going to have to increase to maintain a certain level of income. So now, as a result, with the assuming the same percent on the property tax replacement credit, the same taxpayer is now hitting their tax cap is $316. Coming back to what you saw on this supplemental homestead credit of $300, and this is what I've had some back and forth with the DLGF on about today. I'm still trying to seek clarification on when this will be applied. So in this illustration, just know that this could change based upon how they're interpreting it. But how we've looked at it to date is that this credit would be applied after circuit breaker. So if that is how they implement this, this average taxpayer is getting an additional benefit of the lesser of 300 or 10%. So their property tax bill in this illustration would be reduced by an additional $158. So even with those assumptions, that tax bill would drop, which is great for taxpayers, right? So making those same assumptions with annual increases in levy, the tax rate's going to have to go up just to maintain the same level of revenue. This taxpayer, their portion of gross liability will go up. However, as you give them credit for the circuit breaker and this $300 credit, you can see what the estimates would be for that average taxpayer over time. They're paying $1,533 in 2025. It would not pay that amount again until 2029. Then we get to see some rebound increases year by year from that point. So this is, I know this is really, really technical. What I want you to understand, if you listen to nothing else I say on this slide, is that this average taxpayer's net assessed value is going down, which is going to result in this tax rate to go up. And that is a really important conceptual thing to take away for what could impact Washington schools going forward. And net assessed value dropping, tax rate being forced to go up. So that was a 1% bucket. A 2% bucket, so again, this is ag land, rental property, and long-term care. In 2025, there are no standard deductions, but there is a 6-year phase-in for these type of properties who have up to 1/3 of their property now tax deductible. So only 1/3 of the property, 2/3 of the property will be taxable. This is a property classification that's never received any type of deduction previously. So this will be a new benefit to taxpayers. Within that 2% bucket is ag land. So I think as I did the calculation from a gross assessed value standpoint, Washington Schools is about 7% ag land. So this is a 20-year snapshot of what is called the base rate has done in the state of Indiana for farmland. So you can see in gray, these are the actual base rate amount per acre. Had some pretty significant upward trend through 2015. That's when the Indiana General Assembly intervened and decreased those amounts. We've seen some pretty significant increases again after 2022. And they had certified, the DLGF had certified the base rate amount earlier this year, which included about a 6% increase. But with this new, what's called capitalization rate limit, is going to decrease the base rate value for next year. Then the estimate in blue for farmland will essentially remain level compared to what is now in 2025. So another symptom of, and for frame of reference, is that 7%, another way that net assessed value could be limited or flat going into the coming years. The last part is business personal property. So remember that about 13% of Washington Schools' net assessed value is business personal property. You all could probably, some of you could talk a lot more detail about business personal property than I. So I'll give how I look at it. I welcome you all to jump in and give your perspective. In 2025 and prior, the de minimis amount for business personal property is $80,000. That means if a company or a farmer purchases equipment that is $75,000, they don't have to report it as taxable property because it's, quote, de minimis. That de minimis amount increases to $2 million in 2027. So anything that's valued from 80,000 to 1.9999999 million now is de minimis beginning in 2027. So as a result, and this is my perception, some of you please jump in, a lot of farming equipment is probably within that price range. So now could a lot of that equipment now be tax deductible? I don't know. Looking at all the tables, I don't know specifically that market well enough, but welcome your thoughts on how that could impact farmers. Another area to keep in the back of your mind is this floor. So any equipment that is $2 million or more, if it's purchased in January 1st, 2025 or after, is now no longer subject to this personal property floor. A theoretical example is, let's say GPC purchases equipment for $10 million to manufacture whatever. Typically, on a depreciation scale, a business will depreciate that over 10 years. So in that case, it would be about $1 million depreciation per year. After 7 years, they would hit their floor of about $3 million, and that's what they would continue to pay property tax value on perpetuity. If a business now is not subject to a floor, a lot of companies will have conversations of, well, should we make an investment early now so we can get that off the books and no longer pay property taxes more quickly than what we anticipated? So a lot of businesses will make individual business decisions of whether they're going to pursue that or not. So it's just another mechanism, another lever that taxpayers can pull for a potential impact to net assessed value. I know I'm running through this fairly quickly, so don't be shy about stopping me and asking for more detail. So we talked about the taxpayer benefit to a lot of these property categories. So let's talk a little bit now about what it could mean in Washington Schools. First, I want to show you a quick formula of how it works. Washington Schools is not being impacted, but if you look at the charter school share calculation, the spring ADM for Washington Schools was about 2,512. For students who live within Washington but attend a brick and mortar charter school, there are more kids who attend a virtual charter school, but that doesn't impact the formula. So 4 kids who attend a brick and mortar charter school, only about 0.16%. That doesn't hit the mark for the legislation that says it has to be 100 or more, or 2% or more of your ADM. So Washington Schools not impacted by the charter school revenue share at this point.
Is that a scale, like, once you hit those thresholds, is it a percent, or does it keep going up if if your charter school enrollment was like 500 students or something? What's it, so that?
So it is, my understanding, it's a share per revenue, or share per student per kid.
Okay.
So you take your gross levy, divide it by the number of kids who live within your district. And if there are 100 kids who are attending.
It's just a share straight out of the operation.
The auditor's office, no matter if the charter school is in Washington or if it's in South Bend, the charter school will send the dollars to South Bend.
And how often, Brock, is that evaluated? I mean, on here you have it as a spring, like using our spring ADM number. Is it every time that there's an ADM count, so in the fall and the spring?
I
Or
think
is
it's
it annual?
the way the legislation reads, it's every spring. It's
Okay.
based upon the spring count. This is not, it won't impact Washington
Yeah.
legislatively until 2028,
Right.
but it'll be an annual calculation.
It's just something that we need to track, just to be sure that it won't impact.
Yeah, and that's really the first time this legislation is the first time you see the potential for property taxes to go outside of a geographic area. So typically you're paying property taxes for services you receive within your community. But now with the potential of dollars, like county auditor sending it out of the county even, really changes the dynamic of property taxes. So looking at a quick 3-year snapshot. So what I want you to take away here is, again, how Indiana property taxes correlate. So let's compare net assessed value with tax rate and how it trends. So net assessed value for the past 3 years for Washington Schools has increased, going from 726,000, 809,000, 844,000. As AV has trended up, we've seen a couple of years where the tax rates dropped. This one in 2025 will increase a little bit compared to 2024. But generally speaking, as your net assessed value drops, even if your tax rate decreases, you see some increase in your gross levy. So again, the gross levy is what you're levying, not necessarily what you're collecting. You can see how it works where as AV trends up, generally speaking, tax rates drop, as well as gross levy will do what is the reverse of what is happening with your AV. But the point of all of this is, generally speaking, in the state of Indiana, as your AV trends up, tax rates generally trend down in reverse. So if net AV begins to decrease, tax rates will generally increase. But with circuit breaker and the net levy, it's really hard to predict because 2 + 2 can sometimes equal fish when it comes to Indiana public finance. So I was hoping to draw some corollaries and some finality to it, but you can see that doesn't always happen as a result because the circuit breaker goes, depends upon what the city's doing, what the county's doing. So it's not just your decisions in isolation that are impacting property taxes. So looking ahead, what could happen, sorry, this is not coming out as well as I hoped, but you can get a sense directionally. The blue line represents the old system going back to 2009. I'm sorry, this is not lining up as well as I hoped. Going back to 2009, the blue line is your net assessed value. You can see beginning in 2026, at least hopefully that's what it shows on your paper, is when it begins to split. The blue line is if we kept the current system in place, what would happen to AV through 2032? Would have had a pretty nice trend line if we continued to assume 3% growth per year. Well, we might even be able to hit over $1 billion in AV in Washington community schools. But with this new legislation, you can see that net assessed value actually begins to decrease over time in 2032. So you start to see a wider spread year by year as those greater deductions come on board in 2031. So it's what I would expect if I'm in your shoes as a board member, is our net assessed value at best will be flat, at worst begin to decrease in coming years. I can't say it enough. So this board is, as your AV is expected to decrease, tax rates expected to increase. So same thing, sorry again, the image is not very good. The blue line represents what your tax rate has been going back to 2009. As this board knows, and you've taken advantage of that rising AV to drop your tax rate. So where you were back in 2009, 2010, $7 to $20 or $10, $20 range, to now in 2025 of 78 cents, you decreased the tax rate pretty significantly. But now, if making the assumption with some modest growth on operations fund of about 4%, keeping your debt based upon where we expect it with the new issuance in 2025 or 2026, we are expecting your tax rate could continue to drop if the old system continued. You had almost $1 billion of AV. But in this one, with the drop in AV, we're now expecting some increases due to no fault of your own, of course, just the way the system is working, but expecting some increases in tax rate to be above 90 cents again, even keeping the same assumptions on levy between these two line graphs. So debt planning, I just want to give a quick reminder here, is the gray bars represent your outstanding debt as of today. As you all remember, you'll probably see an additional graph that has a barbershop color in yours. I'll explain that in just a minute. But outstanding debt matures as far as managed debt very pragmatically, where debt is falling off within the next 5 or so years. But with this approved project of approximately 26 million, just know that this is how we have structured it in a way to keep your debt payments near level. This is not final yet. Bonds have not been sold. This is just the plan structuring for it. So we'll update it post pricing. For those of you who can see the barbershop on your own paper, that is a plan to utilize dollars on what's called capitalized interest.
We don't have that barbershop.
Oh, you don't? Okay. Well, capitalized interest is a tool used by a lot of school districts. So when they issue debt, to avoid any increase to taxpayers, you'll pull dollars from the bond issue, pay bondholders, so you don't have to levy it and increase the debt service tax rate. It's just a tax rate management tool, again, used by a lot of school districts. So if we sold bonds in 2025, you see the larger payments, technically we would have a larger payment in 2026 and 2027. But again, it's using that tax rate management tool, we're able to keep the debt service payments flat, near flat. So next steps. All that being said is you're ahead of a lot of your peers throughout the state of Indiana. You're talking about it, trying to get a sense of what that impact is. Check the box. At least you know what's going to happen. Your net AV could drop over the next few years. So as you continue to work with Carrie and Kevin, is what I would suggest is as more information becomes available, try to quantify the impact. You've got a lot of financial pressures coming your way with trying to target 65% the education fund. But if other units, tax rates are closing in, they're going to go up, you're going to get some pressure on your operations fund to even a greater extent than what you're seeing now. So as you start talking through your financial impacts, and you look at your needs, just like any good business owner, you're going to look at what your costs are going to be for the next 3 to 5 years, and do you have the revenue that's going to keep up with those costs? So looking at a sustainability plan, then this is going to be an interesting next 6 years. So it's not just one and done. Don't do a financial plan. It's on the shelf. I continue to update it because the needs of the district will continue to shift. There's some Baker Tilly propaganda if you want to. Any questions? I mean, you all went through some pretty heady stuff, really technical stuff.
On your slide, it's page 18 in ours, but it's where you're talking about the charter schools. There you go. Can you explain that again on,
So
you said there, if there's a charter school out of town, it's gonna get our money?
potentially. So let's, a theoretical example. 2,500 kids who live within Washington schools. Let's say there are 100 kids who live within Washington schools border but attend a brick and mortar charter school. That would put you over the limit for one of the tests as outlined by the state. It's either if 100 kids or more are attending a charter school, that would be a yes, or 2% of your ADM. It's not and, it's or. So if you had 100 kids attending charter schools but live within Washington, there is a list of charter schools that are receiving kids who live within Washington. The county auditor then will have to do this calculation and distribute property tax funds directly to those charter schools. It is what's it called? You have to opt out if you're a charter school.
So it could be a brick and mortar school in South Bend, like you said, but the kids here are attending it virtually.
Not virtual. Virtual kids do not qualify.
Right, but
They have to attend in person to that charter school.
So it could be in Pike County.
yeah,
So,
okay, okay,
South Bend is a bad example.
okay,
South Bend is a bad example.
just because that's like doable, somebody could live here and drive to
Okay.
Pike County. So even
that's
if,
what, okay, that, I gotta admit, that
even if
threw me
it
off,
wasn't in
yeah.
our
That
district.
had to have been a confusing example. That's- But yeah, so that, you know, Pike County, so then
Okay.
Davies County auditor is sending dollars to the property tax dollars to that charter school in Pike County. It's a better example. Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you see at this point though, it creates competition, more competition and incentivizes for charter schools. So perhaps where they haven't been in the past is you typically see those quite a few in Indianapolis area and South Bend and Lake County. There could be incentivized to create more in perhaps Evansville area and Southern Indiana. It'll be an interesting market to monitor.
In some counties, they have to share referendum dollars with charter schools, correct?
That's part of this legislation.
Right.
Yeah, so, you know,
Marion County.
Marion County, Lake County, and St. Joe's County. But all schools now will have to, those are pilot counties in Michigan. Yes, sir.
Okay, so, correct me, straighten me out here. So those four, the 100 students go to Pike County, to a brick and mortar, and is that the equivalent of a voucher? Or would those students take a voucher, would voucher dollars and go on top of this with the student?
So charter schools don't receive vouchers.
They don't take,
are-
okay,
They receive funding per kid through the state of Indiana, exactly like Washington schools.
okay,
But they don't currently receive property tax dollars. So this is
okay, so it's
this
just,
is
okay,
the door opening to give charter schools access to property tax dollars.
thank you.
Yep, no, good question.
Maybe this is more of your opinion question. I mean, it's obviously beneficial to taxpayers, the new administration. But the setups, like there has to see that it's squeezing schools. Like, why? I mean, what's their end games? You know, are they anti-public education? Seem to be. What's?
I can only speculate. I really
Speculate.
I don't know. I can't say definitively.
What would be an alternative?
Like trying to consolidate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think this is part of it.
well, I think too, it's easier to take money away from schools and say that we're spending money frivolously than it is like the cities and the towns that are the basic municipalities, I guess. That's the way I see it, is that they have a preconceived notion. And I will say there are school districts who do spend money like they shouldn't, you know, but we've always been very conservative in this district. And I think that's why we're feeling the pinch more than others, because we've always been super conservative, living well within our means, but then our means just keep dwindling down continuously.
You're going to hear, I've only heard this anecdotally, that you're going to hear the term consolidation more frequently, not just school consolidation, but governmental consolidation over the next few years. And in some cases, it's probably a good thing. And
It's not like your Warwick County or Vandenberg counties that have one corporation
you could
for
see
4 schools.
maybe some townships would consolidate, and some analysis will be done in that area. So we'll see what the General Assembly.
What's interesting to me though is that the legislation, like Jason mentioned, it very much targets public schools, because while everybody in the taxing unit is getting hit with these homeowner increases of deductions, so everybody's getting a little bit less, the legislation outlines for everyone but schools how to recoup those dollars. And that's what's frustrating for me, because we currently are getting about $250,000 in LIT each year. That's going away in 2 years. So while everyone else is being told how to increase that to offset the property tax dollars that they're going to lose. So
That's a really good point, Carrie. And as more levers are being provided to counties and cities like to talk about with local income tax, fewer options are being given to schools. Really the only lever, again, I'm not suggesting it here, that's a community by community decision. The only lever you can pull outside the current funding sources are an operating referendum, capital referendum. It'll be interesting. They being the General Assembly are piloting a program in Marion County that's going to have a separate board who will be authorizing capital projects for IPS and some charter schools. It's a non-elected board that's going to have potentially some pseudo taxing authority.
Bring you good news.
Yeah, thanks for the direct news.
Who would appoint that?
Four times, it's not better any time I've heard it.
It's 7 o'clock. You can leave, Rob.
I'd be offended, but you're not the only person I've heard that from. Of course. Mayor's office, I think some other executive appointees for other elected.
Jason's going, so he may be able to help you.
Yeah, he's submitted. See what's about that.
It's just as bad as that phone call for us.
Yeah, I know. I just never really good. No, yes, great questions. Continue to stay in touch with Kevin and Carrie. This group is ahead of essentially every area in the state of Indiana. So I think this is only my 3rd presentation like this. So if you have any feedback to help me make it better, please share with Kevin. Do that.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rob.
Yeah, thank you.
Share good news.
Yeah.
In 2 years.
Ah, okay.